Hello and welcome to the Doublethink Dialogues podcast. So today we're talking about Taiwan, and I'm here with Ned Marcus, who's a British expat now living in Taiwan. Ned's a science fiction author and a teacher, and I think he's branching into nonfiction now. And he's also was my first guest on my Alternate Futures podcast, so I owe him a lot for that, for taking the chance. So Ned, it's great to have you here today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's just the beginning of the day, but I guess for you, it's near the end of the day with the time change.
Uh, we're 8 hours ahead of London, so
Yeah, it's always fun trying to organize chats across the world.
yeah.
Um, so you are an expat in Taiwan. First of all, I mean, it's been a couple years since we spoke, so I just wonder how you've been doing since then, because the world has changed awful lot in that time.
Yeah, I've been fine. I mean, during COVID, Taiwan was actually quite a good place to be because I mean they just closed they closed the outside borders and um relatively few cases of COVID and relatively few deaths. And we had restrictions. We had to wear masks everywhere, but apart from that, it was really quite free. We could go out and just do what we wanted all the time. So
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, I guess the natural caution regarding China probably helped.
yes, it did. It was very different from, say, the UK, who felt they couldn't close the border with China because it was, maybe slightly racist or slightly a bad thing, discriminatory. Here, no one cared. They just closed it. They closed the border. So
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, it is obviously the China-Taiwan relations that we want to talk about today because, um, I mean, we're in what I consider to be the early stages of a global war, of the next global war. Not everyone agrees with that position, but it is kind of the position I'm taking. I see them as all being connected, but it does feel like there's some jostling regarding China, Taiwan, and with the U.S. involvement. I mean, Taiwan's obviously a very strategic location,
yeah.
specifically to China, and that obviously means to the rest of the world in somewhat containing China. Um, and so we obviously hear perspectives on this from our news sources, such as they are, but that doesn't compare to anyone who's on the ground in the location. Because my experience in Israel, for example, when I lived there, was that life goes on pretty much normally, even though you're in the middle of a war, basically. So I was just wondering your experiences so far then, as we hear these rumblings, China this, US that. So what is life like, first of all, in Taiwan at the moment?
Um, it's quite calm. It's quite peaceful, really. I mean, it's yesterday was a 228 holiday. If you don't know 228, the 228 was not celebrate, commemorates the 228 incident in 1947 when the Kuomintang arrived in Taiwan and they killed a lot of people. I mean, estimates vary from 18 to 28,000 people were killed over a few days. Some people say a lot less. So we don't really know. Um, so it was to commemorate that event. So that was yesterday, but it's peaceful. It's really peaceful. I mean, I first came here in 1988, and I've not been here all that time. But I remember Taiwan, over 30 years ago, and people were asking, the same questions they ask now. And are you worried about China? Do you think China will invade? Do you think China will attack? So I'm so used to this, and I'm so used to the threats from China and the bullying, the intimidation. It's constant. So it's almost every day. They do
Hmm.
something almost every day. They're pushing all the time. They're pushing and pushing. So people are calm. People are maybe a little angry with China when they do these stupid things, but really it's calm and peaceful, and people just go about their everyday lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had a weird thought when you were talking about the constant push by China. It was kind of reminding me of how spammers work, where they just sort of constantly send stuff out until you fall for something. Do you have a fear that eventually something will crack, or everyone just gets on with their life?
Perhaps the people are quite resilient. I mean, they're quite. I don't think that the pressure is working at all. I remember in 1996, I was here then when they had the first democratic presidential election, and the Chinese Navy came and they actually flew missiles over the island or over maybe it's water, but Taiwan's territory just north of Taipei, and they were trying to intimidate the voters, obviously, and it completely backfired. I mean, the Chinese were saying things like democracy is not part of Asian culture, it's got no, precedent in Chinese history, but it just made people angry. So I remember before, in 1996, I remember before the presidential election, people were talking about China. Would it be possible sometime to have a reunification, a peaceful reunification with China? And the economy was growing then, and a lot of people, I won't say everyone, but quite a few people felt quite positive towards China. Not towards the Communist Party, but towards a possible future joining, reunification. Then they flew the missiles over, they threatened, and it's like flicking a light switch. It was just a dramatic change, and people became very angry with China, and they voted in the president who the Chinese did not want. He was actually a KMT president, but he supported like an opening up of China and a democratization of China, and which obviously they opposed. So he got elected. He was elected. So yeah, it really backfired on them. So,
Yeah, that's interesting on a few levels. One of them is the Chinese appeal to tradition, which is reminiscent. I mean, obviously the CCP is far left, but that brings to mind some of the pushback against changes in Western society, which usually comes from the right, with the same argument, right? And it sort of really does suggest a circle in the
yes,
political spectrum, isn't it?
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, authoritarian for sure. Very.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the interesting, I was also watching a video recently, actually just yesterday, an interview kind of young Taiwanese people. How do they feel about China? And it was actually quite positive. I mean, in terms of not the CCP, for example, but the
Yeah.
idea of, oh, I'd like to visit China. It's an interesting place. And they were quite clear that they didn't support the CCP, but they did like China. So that's quite an interesting relationship that Taiwan has with China, isn't it?
Yeah, it's there's mixed feelings about that, really. It depends who you ask. And I think most people, I was speaking just actually about an hour ago with the Taiwanese person about this, and she's actually made a personal journey from being a deep blue, like Kuomintang party, like pro-China party, to deep green, which is DPP, the Independence Party. And we were having a long discussion about this. And yeah, the majority of people, they quite like China, even the pro-Taiwanese, pro-independence people. They like the people, the food, and the scenery, these things, of course. But when people in Taiwan say they don't like China, they mean a CCP. That's what
Right.
they're talking. I mean, that's always what they mean. Yeah, I mean, I was having a discussion I was at a bus stop a few weeks ago, and this woman started speaking to me and asked me about what I thought of China, and I said I don't like China, and she got a little bit annoyed, and then I had to correct because I wasn't speaking accurately. I didn't mean I don't like China. I do actually like China. I think it's a great country in many ways, has many great things, but I hate the CCP. I mean, that's they're authoritarian and controlling and intimidating people. So yes, that's
Yeah, yeah. I'm just curious. I mean, well, first of all, I just discovered perhaps my ignorance on global geography, but that Taiwan is actually calls themselves the Republic of China versus China, which calls themselves the People's Republic of China.
yeah, correct. Yes,
Yeah, I
yeah.
found
I
that
mean,
interesting. Yeah. So
well,
they would
that
probably be amenable to reunification if the CCP, uh, if they could get rid of the totalitarianism that seems prevalent in China, more or less.
it depends. That would be interesting. I mean, I think that's a possibility, but it will take longer. But back in 1996, if China had actually said, "Okay, we're going to take steps to democratize our country," then I really think that, given time, maybe 10, 20 years, there's something, but it would Taiwan. I think the Taiwanese at that time would have rejoined. Now it would take even longer because there's more distrust has been building up. But I mean, the thing about the ROC, Republic of China, that is forced on Taiwan. They can't
Mm,
change it.
okay.
China says they will invade. If Taiwan declares independence, so Taiwan says, okay, we are the Republic of Taiwan. That's it. China has said they will declare war and they will attack Taiwan. So nobody wants to take that risk. So most people want to maintain the status quo. So even people who really, really, really don't want to, and there are less and less people actually who would like to rejoin with Taiwan. I've been looking at recent polls, but they won't change that. Yeah, it's ROC because otherwise they're risking a war, and nobody wants to risk a war because that's bad.
Yeah, of course. Um, yeah, one of the things that was brought up was the by some of the young Taiwanese people was the Hong Kong incident, they called it. So I
Yeah.
imagine that the treatment of Hong Kong probably cemented a lot of people's opinions on sort of, well, their thoughts on China, basically, didn't it? The fact
Yes.
that, yeah, the China really sort of started clamping down on Hong Kong democracy and things like that.
I mean, originally, China used Hong Kong as an example of how you could be part of China, but with a separate system. But that idea has now fallen apart when people have seen the repression in Hong Kong. And of course, we had people came from Hong Kong. Some went to the UK. A lot went to the UK, but some came to Taiwan as well, and they've been living here. And there have been attacks on them by certain groups of people. We think, they had like especially the bookshops. There was one person set up a bookshop which obviously had anti-Chinese literature in, anti-communist literature in, and that was attacked a few times. So yeah, but yeah, Hong Kong is an example. So,
Yeah. Something I'm wondering about as well, because over here we've kind of been discovering, let's say in the last few years and recently with the US southern border, that there are a large number of Chinese coming illegally into our countries. Now
yeah.
we know some of them are being trafficked through gangs and stuff, but I mean,
Mhm.
obviously because they're illegal, there's no paperwork vetting them and their purpose and why they're there, um, who they represent, for example. I mean, there's always fears that we're importing people from the Chinese military or something.
Yes.
Has there been any issues in Taiwan, or are their borders really strong and they're very defensive about that?
Border is very strong. Really, really, it's nothing like the West. It's nothing like the US or the UK. With it's really controlled. They just don't allow that. It's very simple, really. But they are worried that it's very, very likely that there are Chinese spies. I mean, it's certain there are Chinese spies here, and there is some movement of people, and some people come in and then disappear, and
Hmm.
so sure, there are Chinese spies here. That is absolutely certain, and the Chinese are trying to. They use propaganda all the time. They use different kinds of propaganda. There are huge. Recently, we had elections in Taiwan. Last month, we had elections in Taiwan, and again, the Chinese sent their navy around this. They surrounded the island. I think it surrounded the island, but they sent a lot of the navy. They sent the air forces. They're intruding into Taiwanese airspace almost every day, like 20, 10, 20, 30 airplane fighters come in. And so they really push. They're really pushing all the time. Um, Again, it backfired. It didn't. It just doesn't work. This intimidation. I don't think they really understand it. I mean, they've been
Yeah.
trying recently with that wolf warrior. They call it. I'm sure you heard of the wolf warrior. The this kind of changed attitude, very aggressive attitude towards other countries and towards any opponent. And they are extremely aggressive. I mean, they are extremely aggressive. They claim most of the South China Sea. They claim basically to about a few hundred meters, as far as I know, a few hundred meters off the Philippines. And they've been very threatening to the Philippines. And to almost had a few accidents with their boats with the coast guards, and they just send their navy right close to the Philippines because well, they want to claim the South China Sea because South China Sea has huge oil reserves, and they want it. So, but they're always pushing and always
Yeah.
intimidating.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
just yeah, it's interesting with especially with ideologues, right? So the further you get to the political extremes, the less they seem able to realize that those strategies don't work, right? There's some mentality that locks in that says, okay, the threat has to work.
Yes.
And they're unable to take a different approach, which is fortunate in some ways because you can kind of expect it, but yeah, it's
Well,
strange,
yeah,
isn't it?
I mean, within China, of course, to a large extent, it can work because they've got the military, they've got the police, and they have CCTV cam everywhere.
Right.
And even in cases in factories, they've been experimenting. They experiment a lot with AI. They experiment a lot with brainwaves, and they've been forcing factory workers in some quite large factories to wear like headsets which measure their brainwaves, and they're taking photographs of them all the time, and they're trying to see if there's a relationship between the brainwaves and the facial expressions and their emotions. I think they're measuring like your blood, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. So they're really putting in terrible controls. I mean, it's appalling what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah, that is right. That's even more than I've heard. I mean, I'm obviously aware of the social credit system and the cameras everywhere outside in public, but and the sort of link to your travel abilities and your bank accounts and things.
Yeah,
All things that seem that our Western leaders seem to think are good things and want to bring in over here as well.
yes.
But yeah, that really starts to sound to use the unfortunately overused term these days, Orwellian, with, feeding all this stuff into the AI so that it can eventually will be able to tell exactly, well, exactly, more or less what you're thinking just by looking at your facial expressions, won't it?
That's their hope. That's really what they're trying to do, and it's scary. It really is. I mean, I mentioned to you by email the Dr. K incident. If I could just mention that, because that shows so much of what they're doing. That Dr. K incident, for people who don't know, is a British pianist who plays on a free pianos in London train stations, plays boogie woogie, and just relaxes and has fun. And these a Chinese TV crew appeared, and first they were friendly, then they saw him filming, and then they became incredibly aggressive, and they put is very typical kind of pressure that they will put on. This is actually a good example of what they're doing almost every day to Taiwan, to Taiwanese people, and to other groups. And so they study the weak points from different cultures. They actually study it. I've had someone following me around a city about 20 years ago, testing me in a similar kind of way. So if anyone who's not seen that video, it starts off friendly. They ask this man, this pianist, not to film them. He said, "This is England. I can film you if I want." They become a little bit hysterical. He points at a flag, and then a man screams, "Don't touch her! Don't touch her!" And it goes crazy and viral. So it backfired. That incident has become viral across, well, Taiwan, at least Taiwan, even in
Over
China,
here,
lots.
yeah, it was pretty big
Yeah.
here too. Yeah.
And the new vocabularies entered, and maybe the English language of little pink. The little pinks are the people who will patriotically support the Chinese Communist Party at any cost. They just like they're obsessed by it. It's almost a religion. They're
Yeah, that's
so
interesting. The first time I heard the little pink was actually in the Taiwanese interview video I watched yesterday with the young people. So I don't
yes.
know that it's reached over here yet. But that's
I,
interesting. Yeah, yeah. I'll keep a watch for that phrase. Um, the sad thing for me is that it does feel like in some ways this ties in to COVID and the coronavirus, in that it feels like, I mean, we look at, okay, China's doing all these horrible things, but it feels like the Western governments are looking to China as a test case and helping them in many ways, supporting those experiments that are happening because China is a place where they can get away with doing them, right? So they outsource things to China because, oh, you can do it over there, we can't do it in the West, and then we'll just take the results from that. That's rather disturbing to me as well, especially the
it
way
is
the
very
world.
disturbing. I mean that in Wuhan, the what was it the testing center, the laboratories they have there testing like dangerous viruses. I mean, that was, well, at first it was denied that it could even exist by the Western media, but then when they came to accept that really, yes, it does exist, and then it came out that American government's funding it, or at least part of the funding. So yeah, it is scary. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
yeah. It goes a lot deeper than I think even we're aware of. I mean, I think even Fauci at one point came on and said, Anthony Fauci from the U.S. Was making it. I think he was the head of the NIH or something. Anyway, he was the face of science during COVID in the U.S. In the U.S. And he came out and said, well, if you're going to do gain of function research, you're going to put it over in China or something because you don't want it to infect the US, right? I mean, he didn't necessarily specifically say they did it, but there is a big enough paper trail, I think, at the moment, um, with all the companies involved and the government services involved and stuff to be pretty certain, yeah. And then, as you said, I mean, to deny China itself advertises Wuhan as like the largest virology institute in the world. And China, has a huge virus discovery program. I think something like they discovered around 2,000 viruses since 2000, I think it was something like that, which is more than the entire rest of the world altogether.
Yes, yeah.
So it's immense, and yeah, like you said, the Western countries are complicit in this, in that they want to take advantage of this without having the backlash from their own citizens.
Yes, well, China's got advantages in you can do any kind of research it wants, really, because there are no there are no restraints unless the Communist Party, puts them upon the research. So they're very free. So
Yeah, and I mean, we're speaking now of also human genetic experimentation potentially as well, with some claims that have come out of China, and then the researchers were, let's say, quotes, jailed, to which I interpret that as meaning they were put into the Chinese military complex to do research. But maybe we won't go too far down that yet, since that's speculation on my part. So with the wars, I mean, do you guys hear much about Ukraine and Israel over there?
well, of course, yeah. I mean, it's in the news quite often, really. I mean, obviously we're connected to the internet and we can get
Right.
news from around the world. But apart from that, in the local media, yeah, for sure, you get that. Especially at the beginning, it was in the news every single day. Probably a bit less at the moment, but yes, we still get news.
Yeah,
Um,
because I mean, the obviously the Israel-Palestine issue is sort of taking over UK politics at the moment, to
yeah,
the point where politicians are being threatened as well. So
yeah, I've watched incredible videos of street demonstrations and outside Parliament, and it
yeah,
seems chaotic.
yeah, it's a little bit concerning. Do you have you seen then? I mean, I think the West is maybe taking, apart from the countries themselves directly involved. It feels like the West is taking the brunt of the fallout in terms of both funding and in absorbing the populations that get displaced. You guys haven't, I'm assuming, seen any kind of massive ethnic demographic changes in Taiwan due to any of this
No,
stuff.
well, it's only North America and Europe, Western Europe do that. I
Right.
don't, I'm not aware of any other part of the world that does that. I mean, they wouldn't even consider it. They would just, it's not like something people would even think about doing. It's just, sometimes people ask me why are you taking so many? But no, there's nothing, no change over here, really.
Yeah, and you can't give a good reason because it's all insanity. Yeah, yeah. Our ethnic demographics, even in here in Northern England, has shifted immensely and very quickly in the last 6 months to a year. Um,
Yes.
and then combined with the fact that they just seem to be building houses everywhere, so they're clearly preparing for more.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon. And it's certainly going to be the main topic, I think, in the election this year. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We won't even get into the election. We have enough other
Yes.
chats on the channel about that. That's just another depressing bit. Um, So how much I'm just curious, how much does the US support Taiwan then? Do you know? Because obviously with Israel, there's a big support for the US, and that obviously Ukraine as well. And people look at these as being sort of, I don't know, fulcrum points, or like at least I do anyway, within global politics, and Taiwan being another key positional point, which I'm sure the US has heavy hands in.
Yes, at the moment, it definitely supports Taiwan. There are military bases, I think, in the Philippines and Okinawa, as far as I know. And when I think it was maybe in the '96 election, I can't remember, but it was sometime maybe 10 years ago. I forget the time. The Chinese were pushing. Sometimes when the Chinese push too hard, America will send the Seventh Fleet up the Taiwan Strait, and then the Chinese disappear.
Right.
So so yeah, it is good. It is good to have them. Most Taiwanese people are very happy to have there's an American presence here and helping protect this part of the world. So I think that's good. Of course, I don't know. It will depend on American politics whether I can listen to Trump is possibly going to pull back on this if he gets in. I don't know. I don't know. But last
It's
time
very,
he was actually pro-Taiwanese, it's pro-Taiwan. So hopefully, whichever president gets elected, then it will remain that way.
yeah, it's very hard to tell, in many cases. the political landscape in the West at the moment with all the disinformation going on in the media and things. It's hard to know who's doing what. All you can do is judge on what's actually happening in the country, I guess. Um, One thing that people do talk about over here is that obviously Taiwan has large chip manufacturing plants,
Yes.
which gives most of the world an interest in keeping them out of Chinese hands. I guess
Yes.
another aspect would be also the geographical location of Taiwan, which is sort of I guess a I don't know how to describe it, but a key point in that chain of islands that
Mm.
runs around China, sort of in some ways almost locking China in to their own area, so I was initially thinking, oh, if the US builds their own chip plants, then are they still going to support Taiwan? But I think that also the geographical location of Taiwan makes it a key area to defend, doesn't it, really, for the
Yeah,
West?
I mean, it's a very strategic location, sure. Also, I hear a lot of people in the West saying how easily the Chinese would invade. I'm not sure it's true. We don't know, but I'm not sure it's true because I mean, look at Ukraine. Russia went into Ukraine hard, and Ukraine is connected by steps. It's flat land, and they just came straight in, and the Ukraine resisted quite a lot. It's not been so easy. I mean, I know half the world is supporting Ukraine, but nevertheless, it's not easy. But Taiwan is an island, a volcanic island, and so taking an island is a harder, is a much
Yeah,
harder. About the chips, so America, one of the reasons why these factories are in Taiwan and then they didn't move them to America, which many companies in Taiwan would have liked to have done because they can sell them more easily in the American market, is because there's no tax agreement between Taiwan and the US. So that means the companies just do not want to face double taxation. But at the moment, the US government is they're putting through a new bill to have like a tax agreement with Taiwan. So who is to say when that happens? It's quite possible that, and some people are predicting it will happen this summer or maybe a bit later. Then it's quite possible that not no, it's not possible. It's certain is the companies in Taiwan, the chip manufacturers in Taiwan have said that they will set up plants in the US. That's their plan. So
right.
I don't know, change anything or not really.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because what I've heard is that it'll take us several years, obviously, to build those plants.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
once the agreement comes due, well, maybe they're already started building them, I don't know. But we still have got a couple years, which puts it sort of in the middle of the next, whoever's the next president in the US, the middle of their term, I guess, which will be an interesting timing because if it's Trump versus Biden again, both of them would be on a second term, which is always an interesting situation in the US, isn't it? Because they don't have to worry about reelection, so they can
Yeah.
largely push through their pet projects, whatever they are. So, we've got a few more minutes left. What I was wondering is, so if you look forward, like, uh, okay, so this goes somewhat conspiratorially, but that's questionable because I mean the UN has an Agenda 2030, which is now called Vision 2030. So if we look forward to 2030, which is now only 6 years away, um, do you well, let's say worst case scenario that you see for Taiwan, for example, I'll go that way because best case scenario obviously is that things sort themselves out and you stay as you are. Um, and ideally relations with a free China would evolve, but that doesn't seem very likely, does it? So what would you think sort of worst case scenario and then let's say most likely scenario for Taiwan in 6 years?
Like I said, these people have really been asking this since I first came here, like
Right.
decades ago. They've been asking this question since the late 1940s, actually. So no one knows, but my guess is, okay, I think a good case scenario is just we just continue and with the status quo. Really, I think that's the best in the near, next few decade or so. I don't see any better solution than that. Really, I don't. China said that if Taiwan declares independence, which means calling itself Taiwan, for example, that they will invade. So I don't think the Taiwanese will do that, even if they want, they won't do that. Most people want to maintain the status quo. But the worst scenario is that obviously China attacks maybe next year or the year after, in the next few years, Xi Jinping has actually he's done something that other presidents in China have not done. He's said that it is he has promised, he's made a promise that he will bring Taiwan back by the end of his reign or his power. He said this, and therefore he's the first, as far as I know, he's the first Chinese leader to say this, to actually explicitly say this, which is not a good thing, because you have a matter of maybe losing face if he doesn't do it, or so I am concerned about that. I'm concerned about the whole world. The world is kind of crazy, as we know. We've got Ukraine, we've got Yemen, Israel, and Palestine, and this possibility with Iran of more problems, and Korea is also a possibility. So my concern is if two or three of things really get out of hand, and the Americans are going in there more heavily, then China will just think, oh, this is a good chance, a good opportunity just to go in and get Taiwan. Although I'm not convinced it will be so easy for them to take the island or hold the island, but we don't really know. And they're certainly watching Putin at the moment. They're studying.
Yeah, that's an interesting relationship between China and Russia at the moment, isn't it? It's a bit of a
Yes.
bit of a enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
I mean, did you watch the Putin? Did you watch Tucker Carlson's interview of Putin?
I've seen highlights of it. I haven't watched the whole thing.
I stuck through the whole thing, and one part that relates to China was Putin was talking about the long border it has with China, which is totally true, a very, very long border. And he was talking a lot about history. If you watched the first half hour, he just talked about history, the Russian history from the 7th century. But he also talked about other history, and all this discussion of history, it kind of upset people in China. Actually, it made a lot of people angry in China, because they've got their history and their history of relations with Russia. And what is in the far east of Russia, Vladivostok, and that whole region of Siberia used to be, in the Chinese minds, I've not studied the history in detail, but I know in their minds, that's China. Ask any Chinese person, that is China. Vladivostok, the far east of Russia, is China. And so people are quite upset about that, at least in the state-controlled social media. There's been a lot of criticism of Putin, and is causing some bad feeling. I mean, whether that amounts to anything, I don't know, but that interview did upset people in China, yes.
Yeah, you get that impression. I mean, I think even without watching the interview, you have the impression that China doesn't really want a tight relationship with Russia, but they find themselves on the same side at the moment against, let's say, the West, for example. And so they're sort of allies by almost by necessity rather than desire, in a way.
Yeah, it kind of feels like that, yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious. I mean, history, just to end on this note, but history is an interesting thing because it's so colorful. It's so I mean, vibrant and dynamic, and it's so key to who we are as peoples. But it also, we're in an era where it's clearly causing a lot of issues, right? I mean, people claim, oh well, that's like you just said with China and Russia. Oh, we think of that as our territory historically from what, like 500 years ago or something. Israel-Palestine is another big issue historically, and Israel's only been a state since was 1947 or 48 or something in modern terms, and yet they'll go back thousands of years historically. And then we have the issue with Europe, where our history and the West, where it seems there's a desire to erase it to some degree.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. I was discussing history today with a friend of mine who's like Taiwanese friend, and but I was explaining this. I mean, people have different histories. I mean, people have different views of history. I feel that if you could put history on a giant wall, or like a wall of a huge building, and you sat down somebody from the right to some more of a progressive from the left, they would see completely. They would focus on completely different like spots on that wall for sure. And there are different histories being. It's a big problem, I think, in the West, because also people only know a very narrow part of history. They don't know For example, they don't know, they've not got a big picture of history, nor do they know anything about the history of other countries, which maybe had similar situations. Yeah, history of slavery is one common example, but this is a whole different topic of the woke kind of ideology. But yeah, I think history is a big issue. I mean, I think it's probably one of the things that people need to study in the world in schools much
Mm.
more than they do now.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently because you think, oh, well, I think when you become an adult and eventually through your life and you realize, geez, I don't know much about the rest of the world historically, right? Unless you go seek it out yourself. Like, how much of African history do I know? How much of Asian history do I know? How much of South American history do I know? And and then you think, well, they should teach that in school. But then you think, well, they already have enough time teaching national history in school, right? I mean, they barely have time to teach that. So I don't know what would be a solution for that. Some just incorporate it into television shows and videos or something more effectively than they've been doing.
For example, from what I see in the US, with this is the history is being, people who control history control a lot, right? They have a lot of power. So they are teaching history, but they're teaching a very narrow kind of history. So particularly about there's a lot of the race relations in the US seem very poor at the moment. They're going with the identity politics, obviously makes it worse. So I think instead of just teaching a very narrow version of, for example, slavery is just the issue of European slavers catching and taking them to North America, to give a comparative history, which was bad, which isn't a bad thing, but give a comparative history of, well, slavery was very common in Africa. It was very common in Asia. It was very common in Europe, in North America, South America. And this is just one issue. So this is just one issue. But if people can see, you don't need a lot of time just to see that it's happened all over the world, and the issues are not unique to, say, the US or the UK, and the bad things that are being pointed out in history, and there are bad things in history, but they're not unique. They're not unique to one country. It's just human history has had a lot of bad things happen, and not only bad things, but I don't think it would take a lot of time to do.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit tricky because I mean, my from the Canadian system and then seeing my daughter in the UK system, and then like you say, looking at the US system, there does feel like there is a desire to focus on your own nation's history so that ideally so that the students get an appreciation of the country they live in. That doesn't seem to be, as you're suggesting, working terribly well. so perhaps now is the time to change the whole structure to a more global perspective.
I don't think you need to change it very much, because you can
Mm.
still give the history of your country, which everyone should do, but just say, okay, this happened in our country. Instead of saying, this happened in our country, therefore we are evil, you can say, this happened in our country, and yeah, we messed up some things, we did some good things, but this thing happened in all the world. And
Everywhere.
just
Yeah.
two brief examples, you don't need to spend months studying like African or Asian history or South American history, just to show that it did actually happen in all places. The bad things happened in all places. Um, I mean, what's happening in America, I think, is very bad, because
Mm.
the children are being taught, if they're white, they're taught they're oppressors. If they're black, they're taught they're victims. Both of these are appalling. They're appalling. To teach, young black children that you are a victim, that you are uniquely oppressed, is appalling. And it's not even true. It's really not even true,
Yeah.
because it's, and then the same on the other side, teaching white children that they're uniquely oppressors. It's just not true. And it's very damaging for their children. And so I just think teach a little bit more comparative history, and just let people know that, well, what should let children know that actually bad things happened in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So
no, I agree. And that I've been thinking recently that, if we make it through this period, that's not certain yet, but history will look back on this time, and especially with regards to the children, and they'll say, "What were you thinking?" Like, there's just so many attacks on children at the moment, the children's identity. I don't even want to go into it now because that's not the purpose of this episode. But yeah, we're not going to look back favorably on this period and how, and we're going to pay for it as well, like you say. I mean, these people, these children are going to grow up with ideas that are wrong, are dangerous, are harmful to themselves,
yes,
and it's going to be difficult to train them out of that into some kind of healthy perspective.
And the ones who do learn will become angry that they were never taught the truth. I mean,
Exactly,
eventually
yeah.
they'll be very angry with that. And yes, so
And rightfully
I
so, I suppose, as well. I mean, we let it happen. So you don't have, I mean, just to finish on a Taiwanese note, then you don't have this issue in Taiwan, then this identity
well, I mean,
politics.
history. Well, if we can just talk about history, no, identity politics, not really, not really. No, I mean, there is an LGBT movement here. There is gay marriage is allowed, um, is is legal, but there's not a big, I guess, an awareness of like identity politics and intersectionality and these things. It's there in the LGBT community, but it's not spread outside that. I mean, hardly, I would say hardly at all. If we just mention quickly on history,
Right.
I was just talking about history today, that when I first came here, like in 1988, and for many years after, a decade after, more than probably 2 decades after that, I would ask people, what do you study at school? What is the history you study at school? I was very interested. And they said Chinese history. And I said, okay, what Taiwanese history do you study? And they go, no, we study Chinese history. And I was speaking again to someone I know today who's very interested in these topics. And she was saying, yeah, she's maybe in her 30s now, and she grew up as well. It was all Chinese history, Chinese history, Chinese history. So that has changed. That has changed now. Now there is still Chinese history, but there is more Taiwanese history as well. So that's being introduced. So there was definitely a controlling of the history, and that, of course, affected behavior, affected attitudes very much. And her personal journey of this woman I was speaking today, she went from deep blue, which is deep like KMT, pro-China, to deep green, which here means independence. That's what it means. So she made that journey, and part of that journey was reading history and learning about history and learning and speaking to people, about what actually happened. So she found out a lot more. Not that the history they taught her was false, but it was just missed out large chunks of history.
Yeah, that does seem to be, well, I mean, it would be nice if that was the only case in the West, but it is actually in some cases false now as well, isn't it? Unfortunately,
Yes,
over
yes,
here,
it
yeah,
is.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, I can give more examples, but yeah, maybe I
yeah,
should.
yeah. I think we're about out of time for this episode. Well, maybe we'll have to have you back to discuss some history and identity politics stuff as well. We love that on this channel also. But
Yeah,
yeah, and then Marcus, thanks a lot for joining me today.
okay, thank you. It was great. A good conversation.
Yeah, well, that's all we have for you today. So thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed, please like, share, subscribe, and we'd love to hear any comments you have. And we will see you on the next episode of Doublethink Dialogues.